Welcome, good afternoon. I'm standing in for a very good friend of ours, Chris O'Brien. Unfortunately, he's been taken ill, so I'm going to stand in and do my best to present with Anoop this afternoon Chris's content, but we've also added some new extras in just to spice this up. So this afternoon, we're going to be talking about integrating ChatGPT and the flavours from OpenAI, so external to the Microsoft stack, and also the OpenAI instance within Azure. So this session is not necessarily Copilot, 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 but it's certainly the underpinning technology stack below that. So my name's Wes Hackett. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Add-in 365, one of the conference sponsors. I'm also a Microsoft MVP and have been for 10 years. So I specialize in SharePoint teams and the developer space around both of those two products. That's my Twitter handle. And for my sins, I'm an Arsenal supporter.
Right. And hello, everyone. And I'm Anoop. I'm Microsoft MVP as well. And I work at a company called Advania based in UK. And that's my Twitter handle. And I'm a Manchester United fan. Right. So the agenda for today, so what we'll do is we'll start with a brief introduction of Azure OpenAI. And then the aim of this session is to go through the different options that we have with which we can consume Azure OpenAI in applications. And then we'll start with looking at how we can integrate Azure OpenAI in SharePoint framework solutions. And then Wes will walk us through how we can integrate it in Power Platform solutions. And then we have a couple of bonus content. One is using Azure OpenAI, or rather OpenAI, with Fabric data.
Yep.
And then if we have time, we'll go to a private ChatGPT app. Right. So Wes, if you'd like to.
Yeah. So OpenAI is available to the public. It's a third party outside of the Microsoft ecosystem. And then there's an Azure version of the OpenAI experiences that you can use as Microsoft Stack developers. And I guess you need to consider the differences between those two services. Now, fundamentally, they're underpinned by the same kind of AI models, and they move at a similar pace. So you might be asking yourself, why would you choose one versus the other? And I guess quite a few of those come down to architectural principles. If you are concerned about security and you're concerned about how your data is moving between different services, you're going to be concerned with, is it a Microsoft Azure-backed platform? Do we have the trust, the scale, and all of the security mechanics that come with the Azure experiences? So you might lean towards that Azure version of the OpenAI experience. If you want to use something that's a little bit faster moving, but potentially has some differences in the security and architecture models, then OpenAI directly using that ChatGPT endpoint can be the right choice. So as an architect of any kind of AI solution, you are first and foremost thinking about protecting the content and the information that you're passing between the services. So you need to go into the decision of left or right very much eyes wide open. So always consider the very small details in how those service descriptions are described. What model is being trained on which data? When is that updated? And you have to keep an eye on those terms and conditions being changed. Both are offered by a commercial entity. Microsoft traditionally are much more vocal about how they change their position and how they change their security. So again, architecturally, think about which of those options is right for you.
Thanks a lot for that, Wes. And what I will do now is I'll walk you through how we can set up Azure OpenAI within our tenants. So the process, like we see on the slide, involves 5 steps. So firstly, we have to apply for Azure OpenAI. So Microsoft have provided us with a link which we can use to apply for Azure OpenAI. And once that application goes through, we can go ahead and create an Azure OpenAI instance in our tenant. And then we can create model deployments. So these can be various GPT models. And then we'll see how we can use those models using Chat Playground. And also we'll see how we can consume the API within the apps. So if I just come out of the presentation and then go to my developer tenant, which is not that one, or no, it is that one, sorry. And then I go into portal.azure.com. So once the application is successful, I think usually there is a small timeline for that, but in my tenant that has been approved. So I can go ahead and click on Azure OpenAI, and then I get an option to create an Azure OpenAI resource. So the process is quite straightforward. You choose a resource group, choose a region, give it a nice name, and then there's only one pricing tier in my tenant, but there might be others as well. And then we just go ahead and create a resource. So it's as simple as that. Now, if I go back to one of the resources that I had created earlier, so it's this resource, and then this is the landing page for that Azure OpenAI resource. So we can go into something called as the Azure OpenAI Studio. When I click on that, that opens the details of this particular resource. And then, if we look into the models, this particular screen shows what kind of models we can deploy in our tenant for this particular Azure OpenAI resource. So there are several GPT 3.5 turbo models with different versions. There's GPT-4 as well, and the text embedding ADA model. So in order to create a deployment, all we have to do is click on the deployment screen, and then create a new deployment, select one of the models, and then give it a nice name, and that's that. So over here, I've created a GPT-4 deployment. So this means we'll be able to use GPT-4 from this Azure OpenAI resource in our applications. Now, if you want to do a quick test of how this works, Microsoft have given us a playground. So if I click on the chat button over here, so we can create a system message. So in this case, we tell how the assistant should behave. And then we can go ahead and ask any questions. And if you've used ChatGPT, it's it's similar interface. So just ask a question, and then you'll get the answers. So let's try, for example, is Arsenal better than Manchester?
Make sure you write United.
Then there you go. So there, it gives us all the data based on recent form and historical success and things like that. So this is the playground, and you can change the system message and then check how the model behaves, and then you can click on this view code, and then take the code in several different languages. We'll be having a look at the TypeScript code later, but yeah, there are different, there's one in C# and CURL, which is Power. You can use this code in PowerShell as well. So yeah, that's how we can create an Azure OpenAI instance within our tenant. Now, if I go back to the presentation, so that was how we can set up Azure OpenAI. Now, there's something called as Azure AI Studio, which has been provided by Microsoft. So in order to create AI-related applications, Microsoft want us to, or Microsoft have made it easy for developers to start creating applications, and that's where Azure AI Studio comes into picture. So it's an AI development platform with which we can build and scale responsible, safe, generative AI solutions. So responsible and safe are the keywords here. So what this Azure AI Studio does is it gives a catalog of these open source models. So models provided by, say, Hugging Face or Meta or Azure OpenAI or NVIDIA. So we can use those models in our applications. So the idea being, in order to create an application, we first need to choose a model and then define how our app should behave, and then consume that within our apps. So these different models are provided, and there's a benchmarking tool provided in the Azure AI Studio as well. So that tells us if we give the requirement, then the benchmarking tool tells us which model we need to use in our application. And then that Azure AI Studio has got data integration capabilities as well. So for example, if we want our app to interact with external data, then Azure AI Studio makes it easy it has tools which provides data integration. Once we have set up our app with the model and the data integration, we can then go ahead and test our app with the manual evaluation tool that is provided in the Azure AI Studio. And then we can export all this into something called as prompt flow. So prompt flow is something which we can think of as a tool that streamlines the life cycle of the app that we are developing. And all this can be integrated into Visual Studio Code very easily. And then once our app, or once this setup is ready, we can deploy it to an endpoint, and then we consume that endpoint in our apps. So all this is made very easy by Azure AI Studio. So do take a look at that. I have put a link for that towards the end of the presentation as well. Right. Now, let's look into how we can integrate Azure OpenAI in SharePoint Framework. So let's start by having a look at a quick demo. So what I'll do now is I'll go back to my developer tenant and then open a page, which is that one. So this is nothing but a SharePoint page, which has some text content and some images and text content as well. Now, let's say there's a scenario wherein we want to summarize this page in multiple languages. So we can use OpenAI or Azure OpenAI to do that. So what we have here is just edit the page and then add a web part. It's called as summarize page content. And when I drop that, what this does is, let me just republish the page. So as you can see on the page, it gives us summary of this particular page in multiple languages. So it uses the power of Azure OpenAI and then sends the text content to Azure OpenAI to retrieve this content. And then once the translation is retrieved, it is stored against the page so that there's no need to call the Azure OpenAI every time the page loads. So that's one of the use cases. Now, what we'll do is we'll have a brief look on how we can consume this in SPFx. So on the left, we've got our SharePoint Framework project. And in the middle, we've got an Azure function. I'll talk about that in a minute. It can be an Azure function or an Azure web application as well. And then towards the right, we've got Azure OpenAI. So the request is sent from the SharePoint Framework project to Azure function, and then it is forwarded to Azure OpenAI, and then back to SharePoint Framework. Now, the reason we are introducing a middleware, which is an Azure function or Azure web app, is because you could ask, why can't we directly call Azure OpenAI from our SharePoint Framework web parts or from our SharePoint Framework solutions? The reason is to call this Azure OpenAI API, we have to pass in a key. Now, if we do that directly from the client side, the key will be exposed and someone can get hold of the key. So that's why we have to introduce a server-side component. In this case, it's an Azure function. So if we take a quick look at how this works, so the SharePoint Framework component gets the data and then passes that data to Azure function. And then the Azure function goes ahead and constructs something called as a prompt, which we'll have a look at in a minute. And that prompt is sent to Azure OpenAI because Azure OpenAI needs to understand text content in a certain language. That's what happens over here. And finally, Azure OpenAI uses that prompt and provides a high-quality response. Right. So here are some of the use cases. One is to summarize the page content in multiple languages, which we saw just now. Another one can be show different possible titles for a page based on the content of the page, and then maybe possible thumbnails for a page as well. Now, in the future, there might be another use case like creating a SharePoint page which automatically summarizes and gives titles, and then adds some Dutch humor as well, bringing the touch of Amsterdam's charm. That will be a lovely use case, isn't it? Yeah. Right. So what we'll do now is we'll have a look at the code of that particular app or web part which I showed just now. All this code will be is available on GitHub, and the link will be shared towards the end of the presentation. So what we do here is this is nothing but a SharePoint framework web part which is built in React. So there's a component called as summarize.tsx, and that particular component, what it does is it uses Microsoft Graph API in order to get the content of the page. So if you see on line number 40, we are hitting the graph/web parts endpoint, and then on line number 45, we are getting only the text web parts on the page because we are interested only in the text content. So we get the text content, and once we have all the text content from the page, we need to send that to the Azure function so that it can be summarized. So we call this function called as getSummary using OpenAI and pass the content to that. And that particular function goes ahead and calls the Azure function. So if you see on line number 59, or rather line number 60, you can see a function to call an Azure function. So now the request will be passed to an Azure function. The Azure function, in this case, is a PowerShell-based Azure function. So if we take a look at this, what we have to do is, like I said earlier, we need to construct a prompt, and then that prompt needs to be passed to Azure OpenAI, because Azure OpenAI understands the prompt, which is very well formatted. So what we do here is, to construct the prompt, we use this data.json file. So if we have a look at that, you see that we construct this messages array, and we tell that the system should behave such that it's a helpful assistant which can return JSON. And then the second message, which is on line number 10, we say that we need a short summary in English, French, and Spanish. And then on line number 14, we say that the response has to be in a JSON format. Once we pass this to Azure OpenAI understands this and then sends the response back to the Azure function. Now, in order to call the Azure OpenAI, we have something called as the Azure OpenAI endpoint. These will be present in the app settings. So we get the endpoint and get the key from the app settings, and then go ahead and invoke the web request, which means the Azure OpenAI will be called, and then the response that is returned will be in JSON, which we then format and then extract the content from that and go ahead and display that in SharePoint framework. So that's how easy it is to integrate Azure OpenAI in our solutions. Now I'll pass it over to Wes, who will show us how we can integrate Azure OpenAI and Power Platform solutions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Anoop. Yeah. So when we think about Power Platform, this is the kind of low-code, ready-to-use, connector-based experience. So when you're evaluating how are you going to connect that low-code environment with these services in Azure, these services of OpenAI directly, you're really thinking about the Power Platform connectors. Are they available? Do they do the things we need? Are they enabled within our organization? Because obviously some organizations are restricting which connectors are available into which Power Platform environment. So you'd follow the same steps Anoop started with, certainly with OpenAI. In Azure, you would create that instance, you would stand that up in your tenancy, and then potentially one of the good options is to create a custom connector. So you're going to use Power Platform, custom connector approach, wrap effectively the API that Anoop's just been using in that function, and you're able to therefore call your Azure resource from Power Platform capabilities. Now, in the slide, there's a couple of great examples, one from Chris and the second from Dan. Both of those give good code depth to how do you do that for real. So if you're interested in going that route, I definitely recommend looking at those two code flows. Now, obviously, some of the out-of-the-box capabilities are coming. There's some previews that are around this sort of time of year. The OpenAI integration is kind of already there, but it's in preview. So again, you're going to need to watch that evolve as that integration comes forward. So essentially, we're really suggesting that right now, Azure, you'd need to go down the custom route. So Microsoft themselves did have a kind of early version of native integration, but unfortunately things move fast. That's been deprecated, so we kind of need to reevaluate how we're going to do that. So we need to know a little bit more about the OpenAI Studio and how that gets plugged together. And in AI Builder, you've now got an integrated prompt creation mechanic. So if you're looking to use things like form processing and some of the things that SharePoint Premium kind of also does, you'd have been familiar with the AI Builder in Power Platform. You buy tokens, you can consume a number of processes through that experience. And Azure OpenAI is going to get bolted into that for the Power Platform. So it's going to consume the same AI credits, it's going to be managed in the same place, it's going to be created in the same place. And personally, I find that a fantastic move because it means that when you're thinking about building with AI, you're going to that one AI builder. I mean, it's a pretty smart move to bundle it all together. Unfortunately, pricing is TBC. So again, as always with these new things, mileage varies. And we've obviously been able to move to using different GPT models as well. And again, that continues to change, and the connector is evolving. So right now, it's quite a volatile space to be building Power Platform elements with. So you're going to need to have good lifecycle management for it. But the V2, which is the new one, gives us a lot more capabilities. And we've got some demos of how we're going to use those shortly. So that OpenAI integration, as you can see on the screen, we've got classified text, summarized text, extract action points from text. We've got lots of pre-canned goodness. So prompt engineering is the most complicated bit, in my opinion, of this whole experience because you can ask the same prompt 3 or 4 different ways and get very different answers. So in Fabian's session yesterday, we talked about semantic search and deterministic behaviors, and these GPT models don't use that. So you can pass the same query multiple times and you will get subtly different answers. So really working out the right prompt and making sure that you understand what you're going to get back is part of the skill of this development. So again, we're going to see this in the Microsoft Fabric experience, how we use prompt engineering to really tailor the response back from that service. So this all seems fantastic, but maybe we need to think a bit deeper. We've still got some things to get right. So in that out-the-box integration, rightly, Microsoft is sort of saying, hey, we'd like a human being to be in between you and this AI piece. Responsible AI, we want you to think, yes, I'm going to read that, and yes, I'm going to approve it before it goes out. So right now, there's the Power Platform integration, but as it pops out the other end, you have to put a human in between that and being published, being live. So you have to think about, is that the right scenario for you, or do you want to go back towards a custom connector which doesn't need this approval step? So this might be the right thing if you're creating a 100-page document of content. You might want somebody to read that. But if this was a fast-paced sort of text message style, short 250-character message set, very predictable, but you really just want to give the thing personality. Again, this might not be the right solution to use in that space. It feels a little heavy-handed for some scenarios. So the advantage of going down the Power Platform integrations, you don't need any direct access to Azure. So that's going to make it more accessible to the business users. It's going to make it more accessible to the business architects. They're often the people that have those really nuanced, I'm going to just build something for my team. And IT don't really need to get in their way. So going down the AI Builder route is a great option. It's not as technical. So Anoop had a fantastic example of real code. That AI Builder experience is abstracting all of that from you. You are just click, 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 type a bit, get a response. Yes, that looks good. That's what I'll take into my program. So it's very much friendlier for a business team to build up the prompts, see how they're going to behave against the data set, and use those. And then in the flip side, as I mentioned, we've got that mandatory human. So it's not going to suit every single scenario. It's going to be right in some and problematic in others. We also can't do some of the more advanced tuning. So tuning the temperature, tuning some of the payload that you send to the GPT model to kind of get it to be responsive in a certain way can't be done through AI Builder. So that's going to limit some scenarios where you need that fine-grained experience. And again, costs and licensing are a little bit of a murky place, and they will evolve as the service does. So if we go down the route of custom connector, we have to have that Azure OpenAI instance. We need the keys. And in a production system, you definitely don't want to embed those keys in plain text inside a flow or inside a connector definition. You need to think about key vault. So immediately, we're getting a bigger footprint of Azure infrastructure involved in this experience. You also need a bit of skill in YAML, because you've got to define the connector itself, which is a little bit of a minefield if you're doing something more complicated. But what we've seen from other sessions is actually mastering these skills and getting them into the right place. It's going to help you with graph connectors. It's going to help you with search integration. So they are all using this connector-style approach, and it uses the same technology stack. It's using the same definitions for the most part. And the whole ecosystem is starting to feel very jigsaw puzzle and very plugged together. It's just a normal process, calling an HTTPS endpoint. So we're going to have a look at a couple of demos now, and hopefully, is this autoplay?
No, not yet.
Oh, you're going to drop it me? All right, if you can switch me into the video, that'd be fab.
Yeah. So, do you want to explain about this?
Yeah. I'll talk through it once we kick the video. So these are both demos that Chris prepared. So I will do my very best to do them justice. So what we've got is a business scenario. We've got I'll just pause. Sorry, no. Cool. So we've got a Microsoft form that is being used to capture some feedback about a business event. So we've got sort of a kickoff event. Let's say we've got some business leadership turning up, and they're filling in a Microsoft form, and it's submitting to this giant Excel sheet you can see behind me. And somebody wants to be able to react during the day to how people are feeling. They want to understand sentiment. They want to understand what the main topics are. But I've got 100 attendees, and this is getting long and arduous, and I've got to read everything and make sure that I remember what people are saying and who said it, etc. So this is a great candidate for using AI, because we can come into Power Platform, and we can create an analysis flow that's going to use OpenAI to look at some of those textual responses and scale the human interpretation of those textual responses. So obviously, I'm not going to describe every single step in the process, but fundamentally, it's going off to that Excel sheet. We're reading the values. We're going to grab certain columns, and we're going to formulate a connection and request to GPT. So we're looking for the biggest takeaway field. So there we've got a prompt that's asking for GPT to effectively tell us, is it an opportunity? Is it awareness? What did somebody think of that session? What was their main sentiment? How did they feel the session was? What's their biggest takeaways? These are all vital. If you're an event coordinator, or certainly if you're doing a sort of business kickoff and you've got all the senior leaderships in your business there, being able to quickly understand, okay, what's the hot topic? Are people feeling good about what they're seeing? Is the marketing messages landing correctly? Do we understand this stuff? That would have been quite problematic historically. We would have had to read hundreds of rows in an Excel form to get that insight. So these flows allow us to kind of just keep it running in the background and constantly processing that new data. So you can see we've got an empty column in the results sheet. That flow is going to run shortly. Awkward kettle boiling moment as it does. And we're going to see some values come back. Definitely does, right? Yes. Ran successfully. Fantastic. So we're going to fill that Excel out. So you can see 62 rows processed that was real time. So that's, 25, 30 seconds. And now we've got all of that content in. So as the event owner, I can come in and I can see, okay, on the categories that I asked it to categorize each response by, where are we? What is the main focus people are worrying about? How's their sentiment? Like, do I need to bring in some extra coffee, or do I feel that people are having a good time at my event? And of course, because this is Excel, we can use all the power of that sort of stuff, and we can graphically display that as a snapshot to allow us to understand very quickly where our hot topics are as a dashboard. And of course, in some events, you might want to put that up on a screen so that people throughout the day can see these things evolve as we go. So that's the first demonstration of how integrating with AI in the process of a business operation, a business case study, can add value to the experience. Super lightweight. That's not going to cost you tens of thousands of pounds to run. It's making use of that technology and giving the humans some scale. So the next demo that we will look at is analysis of customer service calls. So imagine this is a contact center of some description, and we've got the transcripts of 3 interactions with our customer support team. And as the business leaders, we want to understand a lot more about that interaction. Now, obviously, we're seeing some Copilot experiences now that would be able to say, like, summarize that transcript, tell me more about it. But again, this is using Power Platform. We're going to look at those pieces of text. And we're going to be even slightly smarter, which is those customers have to give us a customer ID. So we are going to be asking ChatGPT to identify key entities as we extract that text, pull it into a SharePoint list. And of course, we can power lots of processes from SharePoint lists. So we've got another flow this time. And I'm just going to quickly show you Copilot for flow. And I'm going to ask, what does this flow do? And Copilot's going to look at the flow, and it's going to describe how this flow works with the services and the data that it is connected to. So again, when you think about even just the developer that's creating this flow, there's a Copilot there that's helping you come back to it. What does it do again? I can't quite remember it. Oh yeah, let me ask Copilot how that works. So we can see we're reading the content, and then there's a set of entities that I'm just highlighting there that we want to extract from that content. We want to grab that stuff and stick that in a SharePoint list because that's how we're going to run our process. So once I run this flow, it's going to go and process those 3 Word documents. Again, takes a few seconds. And what we will do is just wait. It's done it. There we go. So that's running. It's now applying to each file. So we know it's been successful, and we can step through and look at our SharePoint list. So we're going to come back to SharePoint, and we've got the support conversation list here. So again, normal stuff. If you've got new list items, you can trigger process. You can read the flow values. You can see we've pulled out customer numbers, so we know who it is. We can reference the CRM system from that. And we've pulled out all the different salient points and the follow-up actions. And the coolest bit is at the very end, we've written an email draft. So we know the topic, we know the customer, we've looked them up, we can draft the response and just have that sat there for a customer service agent to use. So again, it's just a good example of how the things that you're doing today as a team can be automated, and you just get that force multiplier that adds the kind of next steps. What do I want to do next with that thing? How do I summarize the content? Where am I going with that experience at the back end of it? So those are 2 really fantastic real-world examples of how OpenAI and GPT integration is done through the Power Platform. So we slide us back to the slides. Cool. OK, so as I mentioned, the names have changed already. So the OpenAI AI Studio, what is it? Copilot Studio. Yes. Copilot Studio this week. So Copilot Studio, it's very much a Power Platform maker type situation where you're effectively, everybody that's using Power Platform and integrating with Power Platform is now in the process of building Copilots. Those are constituent building blocks that a Copilot uses. So you're kind of already starting to be there, which is a fantastic experience. So using that studio, we have an experience where graph connectors, so things that we're pulling in from line of business, We've got the studio itself that's helping us do prompt engineering. We can go out to Bing. We've got all the things the classic Power Virtual Agents can do, so the skills and the connections to those experiences. And as I mentioned, it's Power Platform, so there's more than 1,100 Power Platform connectors that you can connect into third-party or Microsoft first-party systems with. So it's a great way of getting your organization to prototype their version of a Copilot that bolts in AI to those experiences. OK, so that was Power Platform. Now let's talk about Microsoft Fabric. So Microsoft Fabric went GA at Ignite, so it's hot off the press, but you're probably familiar with a whole collection of the services inside it. So Fabric is the sort of unification of a whole bunch of Azure platform data experiences. So data storage, lakehouses, data pipelines and processing, so ETL, transformation, loading. Data science, so running experiments against your data. And then finally, the Power BI stack of reporting that data back to the business. So far in this session, we've seen, well, we're integrated into a SharePoint intranet. We had summarization. We had great multilingual capabilities being bolted in. We've got operational processes being used in Power Platform, and AI is helping us there. So now we're talking about data. And the scenario I'm going to go through with this data is, imagine I need to know much more about what's in my file share. You know, most organizations have still got file shares out there. There's still network drives with millions upon millions of documents and folders and stuff like that. And even if you were running a migration project, you've still got to understand what's in there. And traditionally, we would walk around the business and we'd go to every business area, tell us which folder's yours, tell us what's in it, tell us whether you want to keep it, and they just say, that's mine, keep it all. But we can actually employ some OpenAI to tell us a bit more, give us a better insight as an IT team how those things are going to be done. So I've just pulled 25 rows out of a file share that I had access to. So you can see some basic information. What's it called? How many files are in it? And how big it is. So we're going to use Fabric, and we're going to step through some very basic things that are super easy to do that analysis. So once I've created a workspace, I can just simply grab that CSV file. So I can just browse to my desktop, grab the CSV file, and upload it. Now, the first thing that this is going to be good for is most corporate laptops can't open some of the CSV files of that size. They're going to churn and get hot and probably not even finish opening that file before giving up. Fabric can open lots of big things. So when you've got big data sets, even if they're in CSV format, XML, JSON, it's a great way of getting the data into a place that you as the business user can actually work with it. So then we move into notebooks. And notebooks are a kind of place where you can play around. And you can use lots of different syntax. I'm using PySpark. And all I've done there is just loaded the CSV file just to see what I could get out of it. So again, you're quickly able to dive into that content. So how many people in the room have ever had that horrible thing where you've got to create a pivot table in Excel to kind of turn the data just to be able to get some values? You can combine Bing Enterprise and say, right, I have a table that contains path, file count, size in gigabytes, and I'll give me the PySpark to order it by the gigabyte size and exclude anything less than 5 gigabytes. And if you describe that to Bing Enterprise, it will give you the code, and you paste it in that box and say, run, and your table is the answer. So it makes generating that answer, response, super easy. And again, it can move over those large data sets very quickly. So my next step was actually to formalize this a little bit harder. So there's a little bit of syntax there, which is creating a data frame, the sort of in-memory version. And then when that's created, putting it back to a table storage mechanic inside the lake. So then we're moving on to how do we get Azure OpenAI into this experience. So we'd already created our Azure OpenAI instance. It's available to us. It's got some private keys and stuff. So all we need to do in a notebook is bring in the OpenAI SDK. So we're just bringing in the Azure SDK to connect to that instance, and we're going to be able to use that. So the first action is just that install. We're then just setting up our frame, so some of the PySpark bits we need, and the import OS and import OpenAI piece, that's really the same in C# of like bringing in some libraries, bringing in some references. And Anoop actually showed you very quickly when we were in the AI studio and he flicked through curl and Python and stuff like that. That's the Python code. This is PySpark. It's just Python. We're just pulling in that Python code as we go. We need to configure the connection. So we're telling the OpenAI which type of AI connection we're having, the URL, the version of the API that we want to use, and obviously the private key, which I naturally abstracted for the purposes of the session. And then we send something to the OpenAI instance. So you'll see there, I'm doing some prompt engineering as we go. So imagine you're in an industry. I've selected the insurance industry. So I've got a file share that's in the insurance industry. I've got those 25 rows of words. And I want to understand, what does that thing mean? Well, it's obviously, it means something in the context of the business you're working for. So I'm prompt engineering. I'm adding more juice to that response than if I simply said, tell me what that word means by the dictionary definition. So it's again, you're adding that value. And I think that's one of the most powerful parts of it, is you can combine your knowledge of what you're trying to do with that prompt as you go. So I'm asking it, for each row in the table, because this is in a loop, for each row in the table, read the word and tell me what it means in the context of the insurance industry. And then I'm giving it some configuration so you can see temperature and all those kind of bits coming up. And it comes back and it writes me some stuff. So what was always quite fun here is there are obviously some interesting terms there. So draw your attention to row 7, which is 2019 S166. I had no idea what that was until I ran this morning. So we can get that data, and then we can process it into a table. So at the end of that notebook routine, we got that table, and we can create a Power BI report. And Power BI report can be exposed to anyone across the organization securely, so we can get that information in the hands of the business teams. So we have gone from needing to spend days and days and days doing something in CSV. By using Fabric and OpenAI, we're getting a better insight into what that stuff is. So actually, when this came back, it told me that 2019 S166 was actually a Financial Conduct Authority regulation change that the business had to adhere to. So I wasn't a business expert in that industry, and I didn't understand what was in that folder. But because OpenAI did, and it came back, I can now have a sensible conversation with probably the compliance team and say, did you actually adhere to it? Because if you did, that can probably be archived. So in all of these scenarios, you're seeing OpenAI from Azure integrated into your business processes and adding true value. This isn't a gimmick. This isn't something where it's like just for fun. This is actually improving your business process and the speed at which you get to a good result. So we are going to get time for the good one. So you know, they're all options. And as you look at your experiences, you know, you're not just, again, limited to things that you can run in M365 or Azure or the platforms like that. So Anoop's going to do the final demo, and I'll hand it to you.
All right, thank you very much, Wes. Yeah, so we looked at a few options there of how we can use Azure OpenAI. One was with SharePoint Framework, the other one was with Power Platform, and Wes showed us how we can use it with Microsoft Fabric. Now, what if we want to have a nice UI and then use Azure OpenAI? That's where heavy customization comes into picture. And here we'll have a look at one of the examples. So we can call these as Copilot web apps. So think, for example, organizations use ChatGPT, but there might be some policies that say, okay, usage of ChatGPT is not permitted, so it has to be within the boundaries of Azure. So one scenario there might be creating a private ChatGPT, i.e. a ChatGPT-like application with our own branding and with some customization, which could then use Azure OpenAI and then provide responses. So that's the scenario which we'll be looking at over here. So this particular app, it can do all the things that ChatGPT does, like store the chat history and then respond based on that. You can upload a document and ask questions about that document. Everything is all authenticated, so we can use single sign-on with Entra ID in order to use the application. Right. So let's quickly understand, how this particular scenario was built. So Microsoft have provided us with a project called as Chat Copilot. It's available on GitHub, and that particular application uses React as the front end in order to create the web app, and then it uses semantic kernel in order to interact with Azure OpenAI, and there's usage of Azure AI Search and Pinecone as well. So some nice features. Do take a look at this app. However, there are certain things which can be changed. So if you look at the last 3 bullet points, there are a few Azure resources that get deployed, which we might not need. There's some cost associated with that as well. And Microsoft have clearly said that that particular application is not intended for production use. So what we have done at Advania is we've taken this particular application and changed it slightly so that it matches our needs. So if we have a look at the demo, so I'll just play this video now. So we've called it as Advania ChatGPT, and what's happening here is we're creating a new chat, and then in this particular chat, we go ahead and upload a document, which is an annual report of a company. So here we can see what the annual report looks like. It has got some stats on different metrics and a lot of text content. So about 166 pages worth of content. So this particular document is uploaded within this particular application, and then we can go ahead and start asking questions about this document. So for example, here the question is, what was the return for shareholders in 2023? And what happens here is the information from the document is looked at, analyzed, and then Azure OpenAI returns the results, which we can see here. So a couple of other questions like the growth drivers, and a nice response is returned as well. We can ask to summarize the business model in bullet points, and that's returned by the application as well. So this particular app over here in the demo shows the capability of how we can upload a document and crack open that document and then get the proper responses back. So the size of the document, there is of course a limit. In this case, I think it's restricted to 10 MB or something like that. But yeah, those can be fine-tuned because we have full control on the application. Now if I move to the next slide, which is on how we can extend this app further in order to get specific data. So here there are a couple of screenshots of this particular app in a slightly different tenant, and the name of the app is Thomas the AI Engine. So it's a nice name provided by one of our customers. And what we have here is the app interacting with data that comes from, say, Azure SQL. So on the left side, if you have a look at the screenshot, the question over there is what incidents occurred in the year 2021. So the app interacts with Azure SQL, gets that data, and then passes that to Azure OpenAI, which is then formatted and shown in the app. So we have full control on how the results can be displayed. And if you see at the bottom over there, a couple of tags as well to say what system this particular information is retrieved from. And similarly, on the right, we can make the question a bit more specific. We're asking for something that happened on the 30th of November. Again, the information is retrieved from Azure SQL, and then that is sent to Azure OpenAI, which then formats that, and then which then replies, and we can format that display accordingly. And then one more capability is, we can also, right at the bottom, we have got something called as citations or attachments. So if you click on that, it shows from where the information was retrieved. In this case, a set of documents were used as well to create the response, and that's what we see over here. Right, so if we want to build these kind of solutions, there are different elements that we need to think of. So firstly, on the AI side of things, we can think of plugins or connectors and things, something around those lines. We need to look at how the content must be indexed and what indexing mechanisms need to be used, whether we need to fine-tune our app for specific content. And then the data has to be retrieved from other systems. That pattern is called as RAG, or retrieval augmented generation, in which so if we ask, say, ChatGPT or Azure OpenAI any particular question on our data, it would come back saying it doesn't have access. So we'll have to supply that data somehow in the prompt, and then the information is retrieved. So that particular pattern is RAG. And then we also have to think how we need to chunk the data, because we can't pass all our data to Azure OpenAI. We have to get the relevant data, so the data has to be stored in different chunks. So all these different capabilities need to be thought of when creating AI solutions. So that particular solution, which we saw just now, uses different Azure elements. So we've got the Azure OpenAI instance, which hosts all the models. We've got a static web app, which is the front end with which the users interact. And we've got Azure AI Search, which does all the indexing of the content and does the searching and then passes. That content is passed to Azure OpenAI. We've got Cosmos DB, which is used to store the chat history. And then we've got app insights, and we've got an app registration as well for the authentication bits. So all these elements are provided in the sample, and we can take that sample and customize it. Now, what we'll do is we'll have a quick walkthrough of what happens when someone enters a message. So if you read this from left to right, so on the left side, we've got the front end, in this case, the static web app. Over there, the user goes ahead and asks a question. That question will be sent to the web API, and the web API is like the orchestrator which goes ahead and calls different Azure services. So the question is sent to Azure web API. The web API takes that question and then puts that in Azure Cosmos DB. So that's where the chat history is stored. And then the web API sends that question along with the chat history to Azure OpenAI. And then asks Azure OpenAI to get the intent of the user. So basically asking what does the user want. Azure OpenAI takes the chat history and this particular question and then replies with the user intent that is sent back to the Azure Web API. The Web API then takes that intent and then passes that to Azure AI Search to retrieve the content from other data sources. So these data sources can be, say, SQL, or SharePoint. So the data from there would have been indexed in Azure AI Search. So the user intent is searched in the Azure AI Search. The results provided by Azure AI Search are sent back to the API. And then the API can decide which results need to be taken from all those results. We need to take only the relevant results. So the API has some code to do that. And once we've got the results from Azure AI Search, what the API does is it passes those results along with the user's question to Azure OpenAI. So Azure OpenAI now looks at the results and the question, and then gives back a response. And that response is stored in the Cosmos DB, and also that response will be displayed to the end user. So that's how this particular app works. So do take a look at the GitHub repository, which we'll be sharing in a minute, and try and extend that as well.
So that's a whistle-stop tour on a whole collection of very smart OpenAI integrations. So again, just to recap, we had full fat code, SPFx integrated to SharePoint environment. We've got Power Platform through connectors. We've got data management, data handling through Fabric. And then we've got full custom coded solutions using a lot of the Azure AI pieces. So there's a whole collection of resources that you can click on and get more information about some of those examples that you've seen this afternoon. But hopefully you all found that useful and insightful.
Thank you very much.